This summer we had talked about having a second baby. We have a 15-month-old daughter named Gia. David had said his hope and prayer was that by the end of the summer we would start trying for a second baby, and by the end of the summer I was pregnant. I had some complications with the pregnancy fairly early on, and so we went to the doctor, had our first ultrasound, saw the baby's heartbeat, and but then the complications continued.
One of the things that sometimes I would struggle with, just like God, like, okay, the Bible, Jesus pretty much healed every single person that came to him. So one of the things I was just trying to grasp is, how come we're not experiencing that now? God, are you real? God, why am I going through this situation? And I still struggle, with not my relationship with God, but just understanding how God moves and when he moves.
We went for a follow-up ultrasound, and there was no baby, no more embryo, no more heartbeat.
We lost our child.
David and Dana attend our East End campus. Dana's actually on staff there. Appreciate them sharing their story. We'll hear a little bit more from them in a bit. David's question is so honest and so real, isn't it? It's sort of a question that maybe you've asked, or maybe people that you know have asked. If Jesus heals so many people in the scriptures, why doesn't he heal my baby? David asks. The ultimate healing in the scriptures is resurrection, right? Someone's dead and they're brought back to life. It happens 4 times. One time, of course, is Jesus resurrecting himself on what we celebrate is Easter Sunday. The other 3 resurrections that happen in the Gospels, Jesus is a part of all of them. And you sort of have to ask, if Jesus can resurrect these people, why not their baby? In Luke 7, we see Jesus raise a young man from the dead. And the turning point in that story is when Jesus actually speaks to the mother and tells her, stop crying. Not exactly good bedside manner. Luke 8, the very next chapter, we see Jesus raise a little girl from the dead. The turning point in that story is when Jesus comes to the little girl's mother and father and says, you need to have a little more faith. Not exactly good bedside manner. As powerful as those 2 resurrection stories are, they still don't give us a story for understanding our answer for our question, God, where are you? At least not one that I'm satisfied with, and you probably aren't either. Please tell me that God's best answer to our best question is not stop crying, have a little more faith. Because I'm not about to counsel David and Dana and tell them to stop crying and have a little bit more faith. Some of you over the last week have sent in your stories. I'll tell you how you can do that a little bit later on if you haven't had the chance to do that yet. Some of you are dealing with so much. For some of you, the tears have stopped. But it's not because there's been healing or answers. It's just they've been dried up because so much time has gone by and you haven't received an answer to your question. And for some of you, you've actually had more faith than most people in any of the rooms at any of our locations. More faith than anybody else. You believed to the depth of your being that there was going to be healing, yet tragedy still struck. See, we need an answer to our question, and we need a story that gives us that answer for what we face, a story that at once gives us deep and thoughtful answers, but also catches our tears, wipes them from our eyes, provides healing and hope, and moves us forward. We need an answer that at many levels really works. I'm about to tell you the story we so desperately need. It's the 4th of the resurrection stories. It's a real story of an encounter that Jesus had with a family in the midst of the greatest tragedy anybody could ever face, the sudden death of someone very close to you. It's the entire chapter 11 in John's Gospel, so 4th book in the New Testament. If you're following along the physical Bible, go ahead and turn there, or power up, as it were, and it's also in your notes. John 11. We're not going to read the whole story today. We're going to read some pieces of it, probably touch on a couple more pieces of it next week. Just encourage you. There's a lot in this chapter. It's the entire chapter, so maybe read it on your own this week and next. Starting in verse 1, now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not end in death, for it is for the glory of God, so that the Son of Man may be glorified through it. The person who's sick here is Lazarus, and he's not just the brother of Mary and Martha, he's actually a close personal friend of Jesus. And we would suspect, based upon some of the things we see about Lazarus in the scriptures, that Jesus and him had a relationship, they had a friendship, that Jesus was often probably a part of this family, maybe their dinners, maybe even stayed with them from time to time in places that we don't have in the scriptures. 30 years of his life must have been some type of a friendship there. And sort of an odd thing for Jesus to say, right? This illness is not going to end in his death. It's going to end in me being glorified. But that's not that odd for us, because last week, Pastor Kent, in the first week of the series, he talked about the story of the blind man. And Jesus said almost the exact same thing in that situation. And so this is something that Jesus has said before. And the only way that Jesus can say that things will turn out well after pain and tragedy is if Jesus actually really knows what will happen. That he knows what's going to happen in the future, and he can direct our attention there and give us hope. For some of you, you have been, or you are now, in one of those spots where you pray Jesus would answer you and say, this sickness is not going to end in death. Though yet he hasn't spoken, you have a little sliver of hope that he will. You're in the midst of pain and tragedy, loss or struggle, sickness, and death seems impending, and a sliver of hope is all you've got. And I want to tell you today, that's enough with the God named Jesus Christ. Watch the rest of the story. Now when Jesus came, so he finally goes to them, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. What happened? He's dead. Not only that, he's been dead for 4 days. So sometime pretty close to when Jesus actually heard he was sick, and when Jesus was saying he's not going to die, he's died. Bethany was near Jerusalem, it says, about 2 miles off. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. So Martha goes ahead and Mary stays back. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. This is her version of God, where are you? If you had been there, then my brother, he wouldn't have died. And Jesus responds back, your brother will rise again. Martha sort of rolls her spiritual eyes, says to them, I know that he'll rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus said to her, no. I'm the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. And then he turns the question around, do you believe this? Later in the story, several verses later, skipping a large chunk here, Mary finally arrives on the same scene. She comes to where Martha and Jesus are maybe walking towards the house and talking, maybe about a mile away or so. We're not sure. Now, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him almost the exact same thing, right? Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Here's two sisters, same situation, both of them asking, God, where are you? He's dead. If you had come, he wouldn't have died. But Jesus, it says, when he saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, so the whole funeral party has come, Jesus was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled, and he said, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. And then we have the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Now, church, don't miss this. There's something incredible happening here that we don't get when we first read this story. Maybe you've never gotten it as you've read through the story. We have two sisters in the exact same situation, both giving the same God, where are you question to Jesus. Everything about their story is the same, including it's the same person who's dead in the grave for 4 days. And one of them gets a mini sermon, and the other gets hugs and tears. Why the difference? What does this teach us? How does it help us? This is where we jump in to what I really want to talk about today. I put it in your notes, and this is building on last week's message. Jesus knows what has happened, but he also knows what will happen. Some of you need to hear one of that or the other. Some of you need to know that Jesus knows what has happened to you. Some of you need to know that Jesus knows what will happen. But he also grieves with us. This is significant. And this is what sets Christianity apart from almost every other major religion, is that we have a God, first of all, who entered the world. And he entered it in two ways. Number one, he entered it as God with all of his godness. He's completely sovereign. He's completely in control. He's completely powerful over all things. He created life and he sustains it. He's walking along the earth as fully God. Yet secondly, he comes as fully human. And so he gets tired and he gets thirsty. And he takes on constraints and he bends low and he serves and he suffers and he dies and he grieves on his own and with and for us. Some of you today, you just need to know that God knows how things are going to turn out. And in the end of that turning out, there will be restored life. Just perhaps not in the way that you would have liked. And along the way, Jesus grieves with you. See, we learn in this story with two sisters that Jesus has two things every one of us need. He gives each sister one of them to teach us. The first thing is perspective. That's what we talked about last week. And the second thing is compassion. We all need God's perspective and we all need God's compassion when we walk through what we're walking through. Last week, Pastor Kent, he talked about perspective as God knowing what we're going through and that somewhere in the midst of what we're walking through is God's goodness based on his character as God. And we want to peel that back a little bit more this week and we want to understand that God's perspective is that he knows what has happened. And he knows what will happen. But we also see from God in Jesus that we also get compassion. Martha, she's the one that gets perspective, right? She gets the mini sermon. She gets a heady explanation for the tragedy, this back and forth between her and Jesus. She's getting answers. She's getting questions. She's giving questions back. It's a back and forth. She gets perspective, and Jesus points her to resurrection. One of the great paradoxes he teaches, that though we die, if we believe in him, we will live. This is difficult for us to understand, yet alone for her. And then he turns her "God, where are you?" question right back on her and says, "Do you believe this?" Why? Because Martha's heart is on a runaway train towards despair. And the only thing Jesus can do is get in front of her and stop it by telling her there's hope. And he replaces her despair with the hope of the resurrection. We have to appreciate, church, how profoundly realistic Jesus is and the scriptures on suffering, tragedy, and pain that we face. The scriptures do not gloss it over. They do not tell us that life is going to be good. In fact, they promise quite the opposite. And they are very realistic, Jesus included, about suffering, that nobody escapes it and that nobody escapes death. But we also will experience smaller deaths. Death of a dream, the death of our health, the death of a marriage, the death of a relationship with a son or a daughter, the death of innocence. In the scriptures in Jesus, they're not being callous, they're just being real. That we live in a broken world, in an evil world, and we live broken lives. And so Jesus comes and he gives perspective to Martha, one of the things we need, and what he gives her is not, hey, it's okay. There's going to be an afterlife. It's so much more than that. What he's promising is renewal and redemption and freedom and that what has been broken will be recreated, and that at one day, all of the things in this world that are decayed and corrupted and broken will be made new. And we can fast forward to Revelation and we can read about tears being wiped away and sadness being gone and joy and life as God intended it being the rule of the day, not brokenness as our enemy has intended it. And this is much more than a sliver of hope. It's a guarantee of the future of those who are followers of Jesus Christ. This is what Martha gets, and it's called God's perspective. Mary gets something very different. It's God's compassion. She gets to see Jesus become deeply moved and then deeply troubled. And then John tells us what he sees with his own eyes. He sees God embracing and grieving and wiping tears away. And so the shortest verse in the Bible becomes the quickest way to answer the longest question in the history of the world. God, where are you? And Jesus answers, I'm right here, crying. He's right here. And he's crying. And even though God, the God-man, knows what has happened, even though he knows what will happen, he is right there with the power to change the entire situation, yet he breaks down in grief and he weeps like a little boy. He just cries. What are we to make of a God who steps into our grief, even though he can change it? I want you to know that next week, we're going to really step into grief. And we're going to really step into what to do when we are in a moment of grief. How do we grieve biblically? How do we do it? And there's a whole process we're going to talk about next week. And so I just really want to encourage you, if you are in the midst of grief, if you have been grieving, if you know somebody who's grieving, you do not want to miss next week. We're going to jump into grief and we're going to give an understanding from the scriptures and Jesus about how to grieve and how to do it well. And I also want to remind you, as I mentioned before, I want some of you to share your stories. And these aren't going to be shared publicly. These are just for our teaching team. So we've set up an email that you can just send to godwhereareyou@northway.org. And for some of you, this may actually be part of your grieving process. That's what we've seen with a lot of people, is they've never really told anybody the whole story. And so this just comes to the teaching team, Pastor Kent, myself, Scott, Freedom, Pastor Jay. It just comes to our teaching team, and we're going to be taking these. We'll be praying for you. If you need specific help, as you send us an email, you need counseling, you need prayer, whatever it is, let us know. We'll follow up with you. And we just want to know what you're going through. We've been overwhelmed in some of the things some of you are going through. And speaking of stories, I just here want to come back to the story of David and Dana. I want to show you a little bit more of what we filmed with them as they told our story. And you'll hear them talk. They don't use the words perspective and compassion, but you can hear them talking about how God was with them in the midst of this, how his perspective, God knowing what will happen, he was preparing them along the way for the tragedy that they were going to face, and also how they discovered God caring for them and his goodness in the midst of it. Here's Dana and David.
When we got pregnant with Gia, everything was just like A-okay, just went like, we were like, we're pregnant that quick, wow, God's so good. Anyway, so when we discovered that there was no child there, I mean, all I could do was look at Gia and just like, God, you're so good. It was tough for me to be upset because we've been given so much. The only thing I could really focus on in that time was just God's goodness.
In some ways, I feel that God prepared me for the miscarriage. Our first ultrasound that we had after experiencing complications with the pregnancy, I got in the car and turned it on, and the CD in rotation was playing a song called How Great Thou Art, about God's greatness. And as I was driving to the appointment, I just reflected on the fact that when our daughter was born, David had brought some music into the labor and delivery room, and that was one of the songs that we worshiped to before we met Gia. And that day that our daughter was born was certainly one of the best days of our lives. And I felt in that moment that God was saying, just as I was great that day that you met Gia, I am great regardless of what you see or don't see at the ultrasound. And so when there was no more baby inside of me, we believed that child went to be with God. I knew and proclaimed that God is great, even in our sadness, even in our darkest days. So I was so thankful that God had just played that song for me, just to remind me that he is not just good, but that he is a great God and worthy to be worshiped. And he is the same yesterday, today, and forevermore. That doesn't take away the sadness that obviously you can see in my tears. And so I think the loss is still something that we're processing through, and that we've been sad about and are sad about. But I think for me too, it was a test of like, I say I believe the Bible, we say we believe in heaven, that this life here on earth isn't what it's all about. And so I felt that was, a time for us to really hold on to those truths about God's sovereignty and control and over all things.
Do we really believe who Jesus is, who he says he was?
One other thing that God has sort of just been encouraging me in since this is just to not lose hope and to continue to dream about a growing family with David. I just have been trying to intentionally continue to put my hope in the Lord and dream and be excited about the future, while still honoring that baby. We actually named the baby Dylan, because we like that for a boy and a girl. So we felt that was something for us as a family that gave us a little bit of closure and honored the baby in some way.
Wherever you're worshiping this weekend, let's just give a hand to David and Dana for sharing their story. That's not an easy thing to do, and we got 2 more stories coming the next 2 weeks, and they're all really incredible. David and Dana teach us about God's perspective and compassion there, don't they? God's perspective of what will happen, that this security and confidence they have that little Dylan is with Jesus in heaven. They have this understanding of compassion, the grace of how God prepared them for what would happen, and in hindsight, they were able to see that. But also God's grace and compassion in preparing them to receive hope again and begin to dream again and rekindle their hope about having a family and more children in the future. And they give us this understanding of what it means to cling to 2 very important things. Number 1 is God's goodness in the midst of pain and tragedy. This is what Pastor Kent talked about last week. That even in the midst of our darkest times, God is still there behind it, and he is good. And the second thing is this incredible confident hope that Dylan is with Jesus. And that's secure because of the end of our story. And so let's come back to our story and see the power of our God at work. Then Jesus, deeply moved again, right after he was crying, he came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone lay against it, and Jesus said, "Take away the stone." And Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." And she knows her brother, right? She knows he's stinky, right? She's like, now he's been dead for 4 days. I can't even imagine. Come on, I thought that was a little funny. Brother, sister, living together. No. All right. So Jesus, he said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" And so they took away the stone and cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the man who had died came out, his hands and his feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. And some of you stop reading the story there, and you shouldn't. You should underline the rest of the story right here, verse 44. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him, let him go." Church, it is one thing to believe in the supernatural, extraordinary resurrection of Jesus Christ, to believe that God as a human suffered and died on a cross and 3 days later stormed out of a tomb and began to walk, was seen by 500 people and taught and ascended into heaven 50 days later. It's one thing to believe that. It's another thing altogether to believe that every follower of his, Every boy and girl, every man and woman that chooses to believe in Jesus Christ will also be resurrected. That's what faith is really all about. This is not a have more faith, stop crying kind of answer. It's actually a very deep theological answer that drives us to what real hope is and to what real faith is. Don't miss Jesus' passion in this story. It's actually quite compelling. You don't get it in the original language, or you don't get it in English, but in the original language, it's there. He uses this Greek word, John does, to describe the loud cry when Jesus yells back into the tomb, "Lazarus, come out." And it's a really rare word in the New Testament. It's the Greek word krugadzo. In John's gospel, it's used 6 times. Once here, where Jesus uses it. The other 5 times, crowds of people, men and women like us, surrounding Jesus use this word. The 5 other times. One of those times is on Palm Sunday. And it's used to describe the crying and the cheering, loud cheering of the people as Jesus is coming into Jerusalem. They're expecting a Savior and a King, and in a certain way. And as they're coming in, this word is used to describe really their worship, the expression of their belief that Jesus is exactly who he said he was. And here he comes into our city. And then there's 4 more times that the word is used, all by the same crowd, just a few days later, as Jesus is put on trial. In that time, 4 times is used to describe the same crowd, many of the same people, cheering and crying loudly for Jesus to be executed, expressing their unbelief, disbelief that Jesus is who he said he was. No way. Kill him. And church, I want to tell you there's something here for us. There's something here, 4-1. Unbelief to belief. There's something here. They didn't receive the Jesus they expected to receive. They thought he was coming in to conquer in a way that in their human minds they imagined it would be. And when that didn't happen, they turned on him and they pronounced his death. One time they praise him, but he doesn't meet their expectations, so 4 times they call for his death. And I want to tell you there's something in this formula for us. I'm saying this as compassionately as I can. And I'm not condemning you when I say this. I'm just being real. When walking through a tragedy, we expect many different things from God, don't we? Some of you are there right now. We want the person back or healed. We want support for our plans or our prayers from God. We want a promise, a hope. We want something to cling to. And let's be honest, if we don't get those things, if our expectations aren't met, we unfriend God. Or at least we seriously consider it. We don't believe he is who he said he was because he's not doing what he said he would do. And so we stop praising, we stop worshiping. And though we may not call for his death, he might as well be dead to us. Some of you here, some of you at one of our other locations, God is dead to you. This is because it's a struggle for you to reconcile what has happened or what is happening in your life with a loving God. Jesus asked, do you believe this? And your answer is determined by your expectations. And right now, you're leaning no. Earlier when we sang, I need a reason to sing, those were your words. You need a reason to sing right now, and you don't have one. And this is where we come to the question of why. It's great that God heals people, but why did they get sick in the first place? It's great that God steps in, but why did this happen? Come back to Lazarus. As far as we can tell, we don't see him making a choice that leads to this sickness. We don't see something in his life that he chooses to have this sickness. Instead, it's just a circumstance. And I want to tell you today, there's a huge difference between choices we make and circumstances we are in. And this is where the why comes in, because the why for our choices, church, it's on us. It's not on God. We've made the choice. And the why for our circumstances is on evil, not on God. You choose to have an affair. You don't choose to have cancer. You choose to not get help for an addiction. You don't choose to lose a life that's precious to you. The affair or the addiction or the like, the consequences of those choices are not on God. They're on us as human beings. And we have to take ownership of our choices and recognize we've made terrible choices at times that have caused our own pain and struggle, and that's not on God. It's on us. This is the heart of the human problem. A famous writer named Paul, he's in the New Testament, writes most of it, majority of it. He was a great sinner. He professionally killed Christians. That's a pretty big sin. And so he called himself the worst of sinners, and he knows what he's talking about. And when he wrote about sin, the way he talked about it, we all know this to be true. He said, we are literally dead in our sin. We are incapacitated by our sin. We can't do what we want to do, and we can't stop doing what we want to stop doing. This is what he talked about. Many other scriptures testify to this reality, that we are caught in our sinfulness. A famous writer, another one, G.K. Chesterton, very influential in the conversion of C.S. Lewis. Someone famously asked G.K. Chesterton, said, "What's wrong with the world?" And he famously replied, "I am." Just 2 words. I am. And there's a sense where that's true. Now, some people, and some of you are thinking this, you're bright, you're thinking through my argument, and you're saying, okay, then why doesn't God remove our ability to do this? If he's got the power over sin and he's already conquered it, why doesn't he remove evil? Why doesn't he remove our autonomy? Why doesn't he remove evil from our hearts and perfect us? And I just want to tell you, this is the argument I like to call the Stepford Wives argument. If you've seen the movie, the men in the town, one by one, replace their wives with automated robotic lookalikes who do exactly what they want and are absolutely perfect in every way, including how they cook and look. Now, husbands, would you really want to replace your wife with a good-looking robot who does whatever you say and is absolutely perfect? You were supposed to say no. You were supposed to look at your wife and say, absolutely not. You're precious to me. I wouldn't want to replace you with a robot. You're perfect just the way you are. And those of you that didn't do that, you can be asking God, where are you? A little bit later. You are. Guys, the answer is no. Despite their seeming perfection, the Stepford robot women are incapable of true love and intimacy and companionship. They're incapable of entering into a covenant with us, making us sharper, making us better. And they play to this picture of Photoshop beauty that is so far from what real beauty really is. Proverbs 31, charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting. But precious, right? And beautiful is the woman who fears the Lord. That's real beauty. Oh, and they're robots. Human beings are not robots. We've been created with a free will, and we can make choices all the way back to the first couple. And we're also sinful, just like the first couple. And evil does exist, and it gets in the middle of our choices, and it pushes us towards one side. Bad choices. And sometimes this causes us to be caught in a terrible choice, while at other times we are caught in terrible circumstances, which sometimes is actually a circumstance that's related to somebody else's terrible choice. And so from God's perspective, still being compassionate, he sees our world and he says, it's so broken, it's so evil, it's so sinful, I am going to do something about it. That's what his compassion drives him to do. And so he enters the world and he conquers sin and evil, both in us and in the world. And it doesn't undo the tragedy of pain and sickness and death in our life, but it provides an anchor of hope in God's goodness, in this strong belief that our own resurrection will happen if we believe in him. Earlier in all of our locations, we sang this old hymn of the faith, It Is Well, written by Horatio Spafford. If you don't know the story, you can get a little bit more of the story later, but here's the highlights of it, a reason this hymn was written. He lived in Chicago with his 4 daughters and his wife. He sent them on a transatlantic ship back in about 1873, and the ship went down. And he was supposed to be on that ship with them, but he wasn't. He got held back in Chicago and was going to catch one a few days later. And as their ship went down, all 4 of his daughters died. And his wife was the only survivor of his family. And she sent back this now famous telegram, "Saved alone." That was it. Shortly afterwards, as he traveled to meet his wife on the other side of the Atlantic, and the ship that he was on passed the site where this happened, he wrote down the hymn that we were singing. "When sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." How in the world could a father who lost his 4 daughters write that? Could you? It's because there wasn't a choice that he made. It was a circumstance he was in. And he was in a place where he discovered what Martha and Mary discovered. That God's perspective gives us a promise of resurrection if we believe in him. And God's compassion, that God was grieving with him. This isn't a trite answer to God, "Where are you?" This isn't "stop crying, have a little more faith." This is a deep belief that Jesus is who he said he was and will do what he said he will do. And so the song goes on, and we say, "My sin is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more." See, even a terrible choice we've made. Some of you are listening today and you're participating, and there's been a terrible choice that you've made and you know about it. You need to know that that choice is nailed to the cross with Jesus Christ, and there's forgiveness there for you. We also sang in the psalm, "My faith shall be made sight," that one day we will see and understand that now we can't. It's like looking through a glass darkly, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 13. And so one day we will see clearly. And some of you that have walked through train and tragedy, you need to cling to that. You know that one day you will understand, but in the midst of this, God is still sovereign and his compassion is there for you. And if you ever doubt God's compassion, if you ever doubt his perspective that he wants to do something about this and he wants to guarantee what will happen for all those who believe in him, you look no further than the cross. And do you know that on the cross, the God of the universe, as he hung there with our sin weighting him down, suffocating under my sin and yours, do you know that as he died, he asked, "God, where are you?" Do you know that? He asked our question. One of the 6 things that he uttered on the cross was, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is God of God who's uttering, my God, where are you?" The Son of God hanging on a cross for you and me, saying, "God, where are you? Why am I alone? Why are we doing this?" Yet he stays there. He continues to hang. He defeats sin by dying on a cross and bearing the consequence of sin and evil in our lives. Church, don't waste that death unless you want your own. Some of you today, you need to know this, that God saw what happened to you. He did. And it was not a part of his design, and it was not a part of his plan. But he is with you in it. He's not turned his back on you. He's grieving with you. And he wants to lead you to a place of freedom. Some of you today, you need to know that God saw the choice you made. And he knows it, and you know that it was sin at its finest. And it was not part of his design. It was not part of his plan. But that sin that you're thinking about, it's not too big for the cross. No sin, he wants you to know, is beyond what he paid for on the cross. And there's no condemnation from him to you. There's no guilt from him to you. There's no shame from him to you. He's with you. He's not turned his back on you. He grieves with you, and he longs to lead you to a place of freedom. Some of you today are on a train heading down the tracks of despair, and you are clinging to a sliver of hope. That's all you've got. That the sickness will be healed, that the son will return, that the job will be found, that the marriage will be restored. And you need to know that God sees what is happening. He knows what you're going through. He knows what will happen. And what you've been facing is not a part of his plan. It's not part of his design, but he's with you. And he's grieving with you. And he has not turned his back on you. And he longs to lead you to a place of freedom. And some of you in this room, you have lost someone so dear to you, so close to you, and in some cases, such a tragic way. And if that loved one knew Jesus, you need to know that this story about Lazarus is your loved one's story. And that upon their death, before you even heard that they had passed from this life, Jesus Christ was meeting them and welcoming them into real life, leading them to a place of freedom. And Jesus had already gathered the saints around and said to your loved one, unbind him, let him go, he's free. Unbind her, let her go, she's free. The resurrection is real. You see, sometimes we need a God who empathizes with what has happened. Sometimes we need a God who directs our hearts away from despair and into hope. Sometimes we need a God who cries with us. Sometimes we need a God who simply will forgive the awful choices we have made. And sometimes we need a God who we can trust will receive our loved ones and give them the future that he has promised and unbind whatever has bound them and set them free. And sometimes we need a God who we know will do the same with us when we leave this life. In Jesus, we find that God, and nowhere else will you find him. If we would just believe. And so we come back to the greatest question that Jesus ever asked any human being. Do you believe?